Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of The Congregation. My name's Ryan MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod, and we've got a lot to discuss this week. We've got not 1, 2, 3 but 4 subjects, although I am slightly cheating in that two of them I should say, are both based around Final Fantasy, so we'll save that for a little bit later. And we're also going to be discussing briefly recent allegations against Activision-Blizzard. Particularly Blizzard, it seems. We won't go too in depth on that one because it's still a case developing. But before we get to all of that nastiness and all of the Final Fantasy goodness, keep it balanced, we'll go for something a bit more impartial to start with. This week, Ubisoft announced their new free-to-play multiplayer shooter XDefiant, or specifically Tom Clancy's XDefiant. For those of you who don't know, it's basically going to be a free-to-play shooter that mashes up various factions from the Tom Clancy Ubisoft IPs. There's a faction from The Division, there's a faction from Splinter Cell, a faction from Ghost Recon, I believe. Now, to be perfectly honest, it doesn't appeal to me. It just seems like another Call of Duty style multiplayer shooter, and from as far as I can tell, it's intended to be a COD killer, it's essentially. But based on the tepid reception I was seeing online at the time, that's probably going to be a pretty high bar to reach. The biggest confusion I think I've seen from a lot of people was, okay, but where's our new Splinter Cell game? I think a lot of people wanted a new Splinter Cell game for a long time, and even when they put Sam Fisher into Ghost Recon Breakpoint, everyone's just like, okay, this is good, but where's our new Splinter Cell game? I am very much in that camp, you know. When we live in an age where the new Hitman revival trilogy from IO Interactive really hit the nail on the head as to what a stealth assassination style game can be, it honestly feels like money on the table at this point. But que sera, Ubisoft are going the live service route, fair play. But my biggest question about the announcement of Tom Clancy's XDefiant is the Tom Clancy name. Now, the idea of the game is that it's going to incorporate various factions from various Tom Clancy Ubisoft IP. So you've got one faction from Splinter Cell, one faction from Ghost Recon, one faction from The Division, so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to start with an article because I think that the uncredited writer here kind of hints at what I'm trying to get at here. And I'm just like confused at this point about the use of the name Tom Clancy, because Tom Clancy's always been synonymous with tactical espionage thrillers, not this mad mashup of IPs and high octane action. So I'm going to read out this article first. It's called "The Bizarre Tale of How Tom Clancy Sold His Name to Rainbow Six Siege." It's from PCGamesN.com and the writer is uncredited. As usual, this is excerpts from the article, so if you want to read the full article, the links will be in the description. So, Tom Clancy died in 2013. This may come as a surprise to many players of Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, which was released 2 years after his death in 2015. Clearly, Clancy had very little to do with the making of the game, so why is his name embezzled across the packaging? For a generation of gamers, Tom Clancy's name is synonymous with Ubisoft and a certain brand of military shooter. Many young players may not even know that he was also a phenomenally successful author, selling around 100 million books in his lifetime. Instead, there's no shortage of people asking, who is Tom Clancy on the internet? Tom Clancy released his debut novel, The Hunt for Red October, in 1984. He wrote it in his spare time while working for an insurance agency, and he was 37 when it was released to great acclaim and phenomenal success. It ended up selling well over 2 million copies. So started Clancy's career of penning best-selling military thrillers, lauded for their technical detail and top plotlines. The first video game based on Tom Clancy's works was released in 1987, a submarine simulator for PC that was adapted from The Hunt for Red October. It was heralded as the start of an extremely long lineage of Tom Clancy games that would extend far beyond the author's untimely death from suspected heart failure at the age of 66. Following further reports of the hunt of Red October and the release of another submarine sim, Red Storm Rising, based on the same novel of the same name, Tom Clancy co-founded game developers Red Storm Entertainment, along with Royal Navy Captain Doug Littlejohns and game producer Steve Reed. The company released Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six in 1998, a tactical shooter based on the Rainbow Six novel, in which a multinational counter-terrorism team is deployed around the world. It received a rapturous reception from the press, and though not technically the first tactical shooter, it revolutionised the genre and spawned many imitators. So far so good, but then Ubisoft stepped in, bringing us one step closer to the phantom influence of Tom Clancy. The French company bought Red Storm Entertainment in 2000 and oversaw the release of around half a dozen Rainbow Six games over the next 8 years, with later titles being developed by other Ubisoft studios such as Ubisoft Montreal. Red Storm Entertainment, meanwhile, created several tactical shooters under the Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon. What's odd about these titles is that unlike Rainbow Six, the Ghost Recon games weren't based on any of Tom Clancy's books, yet still bore his name. Since Tom Clancy co-founded the studio, it presumably made sense that the Ghost Recon games carry his name. Wherever the author had any input in creation is unknown. It was after this something extraordinary happened. In 2008, in an unexpected move, Ubisoft simply bought Tom Clancy's name. To clarify, they didn't agree a license to use his name, they simply bought it. The deal gave Ubisoft, quote, intellectual property rights to the Tom Clancy name on a perpetual basis and free of all related future royalty payments for use in video games and ancillary products including related books, movies and merchandising products. The precise terms of the deal have never been made publicly disclosed, but it appears that Clancy essentially gave up having any say about how his name would be used and forfeited any future royalty payments he might have gained from it, all for a sum that is likely to have totaled multiple millions. Tom Clancy is no longer the name of a man. It is a brand that singles the undercover world of spies and counter-terrorism and a certain kind of taut military shooter. Several authors have continued to write stories based on Clancy's characters, like Jack Ryan. It's notable that the writers' own names appear in small type on the covers, while the brand name Tom Clancy fills nearly half of the page. Clancy was free to use his own name in all his personal life, and most importantly, on his books. But when it came to video games and ancillary products, his name was no longer his own. Which begs the question, what does the name Tom Clancy actually signify? And I did not know about this until I started researching it after the announcement of XDefiant. Basically, the thought that was going through my head when they announced XDefiant was, is this something that the Tom Clancy estate, his living relatives and so on, is this something that they sign off? Do they sign off on everything that gets put out there by Ubisoft? And if so, was this a case of they just wanted the paycheck, or was it a case of Ubisoft saying, well, actually we've got an agreement for so and so years, so we're going to go ahead and release this anyway? Turns out they just outright own the name Tom Clancy as far as putting it on their products, which at this point it's a name recognition thing, and it's something that unfortunately Ubisoft just seem to be pursuing with most of their IPs. Assassin's Creed, for example, has not been a true Assassin's Creed game in at least a console generation. Ever since Black Flag, I would say, they've very much abandoned what they set up in the original trilogy of games and Brotherhood games. This whole meta-narrative about precursor humans, civilization that came before our own, that was all really interesting and intricate storytelling. But then after a while, they just decided to treat it as a historical sim. They still do the meta-narrative, but it's very much pushed into the background. It's there if you want to look for the Easter eggs and things like that, which, you know, on one hand, yeah, it's good that they're moving the franchise forward, etc. And a lot of people did not like the meta-narrative, to be perfectly honest. But at what point does it stop being the franchise that it started out being? If anyone's watched WandaVision, it's like the conversation that Vision has with himself, the Bridge of Thesis, I think it was called, where if you take all the parts out, is it still the same thing when you replace them? And again, we're seeing this now with the Tom Clancy IPs. You know, for a lot of aged gamers who go back to sort of the PS1, even a bit earlier, as the article lays out, the earlier games of Tom Clancy were in line with his works. They were not necessarily low-key, but they weren't about the action. They were about the espionage and, you know, tactical military deployment. Whereas in recent games, it's kind of very much more gung-ho. Now, I will point out that, as I said, this is an excerpt of an article, but it's more excerpted than I usually do. In fact, it's probably about only half the article. If you're interested, the link will be in the description below, because the uncredited writer goes a lot into about Tom Clancy himself and his politics. It kind of leans on the right-wing side of things, being a man of military interest. That's not necessarily surprising. But I've left that out here because I just wanted to focus on the why. You know, I was very curious to know about how the Tom Clancy situation pans out, and I got my answer here, and I hope that if you didn't know beforehand that you do now. I really wish that the Tom Clancy IP, even just as a goodwill gesture to the long-term fans of the IP, would just release one game that's more low-key, stealth-like. I would be perfectly happy for them to take the recent free Hitman games, take that game cycle and reskin it with Splinter Cell. I would be perfectly fine with it at this point. At least that would be something. And they can monetize it if they wanted to. Extra levels, extra weapons, whatever Ubisoft needs to do to justify it. At this point, the Tom Clancy brand isn't really in line with what the Tom Clancy brand should be. It's just something to stick on the label so gamers go, ah, I recognise this name. Que sera, sera, I say again. But here we go. But let's go into something a little bit more personal to me. This week, Final Fantasy X celebrated its 20th anniversary. And I'm just going to start by reading out this article by Miss Jessica Rami. I hope I'm pronouncing that surname right. And this is from TheGamer.com. And it's titled, Yuna and the Strong Female Character. How Final Fantasy X Changed My Perspective. And by reading this, Jessica, you changed my perspective as well, as you'll hear in a moment. Whether it meant to or not, Final Fantasy X ultimately ended up changing my preconceived notion of what a strong female character could be. Final Fantasy X is a game that undoubtedly turned a lot of heads when it was first released. A lengthy JRPG in a popular series, and the first one from Final Fantasy games to have voice acting, the fantasy epic both challenged and carried out a lot of series traditions. Yoshinori Kitase, the producer behind 10, said in an interview that he wanted to change people's preconceived ideas of fantasy within the game, to change the idea that fantasy settings meant medieval European themed. Whether it meant to or not, Final Fantasy X ultimately ended up being changing another entirely separate preconceived idea that I had when I first picked up the game in middle school, that a strong female character could not also be gentle. How did a game make me completely change the way I look at media? It's simple. Yuna. For anyone who hasn't played 10 yet, brace for spoilers ahead. I'm assuming most people watching this have probably played 10, but just in case, I think a lot of this will actually seem a bit out of context for you. So feel free to stick around if you think you can glaze over some of these fine details. I'll continue. Yuna is the female protagonist of FF10, and someone that a lot of folks probably found it easy to typecast. I did anyway. Another soft-spoken, polite wallflower type girl, complete with a bit of pining after the central male character. At 12 years old, I saw her and basically expected her to be set dressing to Tidus' story, Tidus being the main character. Then I reached Killica and watched the iconic send-in scene and thought, alright, she's a bit melancholic too. It wasn't until I replayed later that I realised just how impactful that early scene alone was. Here we've got a 17-year-old orphan agreeing to not only take on a difficult journey, as it is admittedly a JRPG staple, but actually to take it a step further and take up the mantle of, let's face it, the closest thing the Final Fantasy X universe has to our Mortician. To willfully surround herself with the dead, dying and grieving, and offer everything she can. The send-in scene is beautiful and, as Tidus points out in his narration, horrifying and strange. Lulu even notes offhand, after the cutscene, that the performing the send-in actually brought Yuna to tears. It's not something she does because she enjoys it, or that it comes naturally to her. Yuna's strength and appeal, for me, wasn't that she carried out her job faithfully. It wasn't that she never had moments of weakness, or that she had a disregard for her life. Did I mention that summoners die at the end of their journey? That made her cool, like many other strong female characters of the time. On the contrary, she acknowledged her feelings, even recorded them to make sure they'd be understood later after her death, and admitted to Tidus that she did have moments of sadness. She pushed through them because she felt she was doing what was important. It was an impressive level of commitment, and I'd respected it, but those things in the end of themselves weren't what made me reevaluate the way I look at strength in media. The most powerful thing Yuna did in the story was actually abandon her duty. Even being excommunicated from the church didn't stop her from carrying out her pilgrimage to the letter. But when she was told that finishing it meant killing one of her guardians, she stopped. Rather than give up and let Sin continue rampaging, or defeat Sin but sacrifice her morality in the process by killing a friend, Yuna rejected both options. 2 lives was not, in Yuna's eyes, an acceptable price to pay for what amounted to a temporary solution. Yet another 10-year hold built on a lie wasn't good enough. When the world asked her to be cruel, she refused, and that refusal turned out to be a step towards a much more permanent resolution. To me of middle school, constantly submerged in a stream of escalating violence portrayed as heroism, of the strong female character always having to be a combat proficient as Black Widow, Yuna was a more unique story. She wasn't dismissed by the narrative as a weak-willed or stupid for trying to be nice, nor did she die a martyr, even if she planned on it at first. She was kind, and she survived to see that kindness vindicated. At the end of everything she'd suffered to get to that point, Yuna's victory held a more important lesson. Kindness is not weakness. It was kindness that killed Sin for good. The rejection of sacrifice just for sacrifice's sake. Yuna was strong without sacrificing her gentleness. When I finished and really looked at the game, I recognised that she was strong because she's so kind. She bore the weight of sendings and made the decision to become a summoner because she saw sorrow and wanted to ease it. Even knowing much of that decision was also rooted in following her father's legacy, the main driving force behind her decisions was deceptively simple. She just wanted to help people, however she could. And that was honestly incredible. Final Fantasy X subverted a lot about the series, but kept a lot the same. Final Fantasy protagonists rarely compromise their ideals, but they're also usually men, and that comes with its own set of pitfalls. Yuna is handled with a great deal of respect in the story, in a way I realised was rare in 2012, and probably rarer still in 2001, when the game first came out. So much buzz about female characters in media comes from their action scenes. Lara Croft is strong because she can wipe out an island full of cultists basically solo. Lightning from Final Fantasy X+14 is strong because she has a gunblade and no time for bullshit. This isn't an attempt to dismiss them and their narrative arcs. It's just to point out the popular perception of these martially skilled characters versus characters like Yuna, which are considered strong by most people. What Yuna speaks to, which very few other female characters in the media I consumed did, is the idea that strength of a character can matter just as much as physical strength. That choosing to do things that might be difficult or painful because the right thing to do is a type of strength everyone is capable of, not just action heroes. Strength for Yuna and me and so many other people isn't and shouldn't be about rejecting and distancing ourselves from what others consider weakness. Strength can be found in dignity and kindness, and refusing to partake in necessary evils just because they might temporarily make our lives easier. I've never forgotten that idea, even closing in on a decade since having played 10 for the first time. And those are some really eye-opening words by Jessica there. I've played Final Fantasy X, I don't know how many times. I've completed it only about half those times. For the sake of argument, let's say I've played it 20, completed it 10. It's probably a bit less than that. Sometimes I'll just feel nostalgic and I'll start it but not necessarily finish it. A new game will come out or something. But the last time I actually played it was nearly 5 years ago at this point, maybe 6. It was whenever it came out for the PS4 in its remastered version. Now, when I was young and it first came out and I bought it brand new, I immediately related to Tidus being the main character, and being a young boy myself, it's easy to put myself into his shoes mentally while playing the game, relatable protagonists, etc. It wasn't until years later that, although I didn't see it from this perspective, I realised that it wasn't Tidus' story really, it was Yuna's story told through Tidus' eyes. Now, what Jessica's pointed out here, when I read it for the first time, absolutely blew my mind. It's not as if I didn't actually recognise this in the first instance, it's just she lays it out so beautifully in this article. This is one example where I believe I've used the full article, I've not excerpted it at all. I think I removed 1 or 2 paragraphs just for the sake of pacing, so if you want to, the link's down in the description below if you want to read the full article, and there's some nostalgic screenshots there as well. But in a genre, I should say in an industry, where strength of a character is determined by how big their gun is, Doom Guy, I'm looking at you, or how loud your chainsaw is, Marcus Phoenix, I'm looking at you. Sometimes we forget that strength of character is more important than strength of the body, mind over matter and what have you. But I just wanted this little article just to celebrate 20 years of Final Fantasy. No poignant point on this one, but I think I'm going to start replaying Final Fantasy X now, and now that I've had Jessica here to open me to a new perspective on it, I think I'll play that looking through that lens there. So thank you, Jessica there. So we're going to come back to Final Fantasy a little bit later. We've got another bit of Final Fantasy to cover. But before we get into that, just this week, Activision-Blizzard, or specifically Blizzard, has been accused and investigated and what have you for allegations of sexual misconduct in the workplace. Following a 2-year investigation in California, it seems there's some legal action going to come about of this. Now, for the first time in what feels like a long time, it feels like there's going to be genuine repercussions for a company as big as Activision-Blizzard for this. Which is good, despite it coming out of such negative circumstances. As of now, at the time of recording, all of Activision-Blizzard's social media channels are on silent. They're not posted, they're not tweeted at all. A new map that was meant to come out for Overwatch did not come out. They're running complete, media and radio silence. So it's a very serious situation, as serious as the actual allegations themselves. Now, we're not going to discuss the actual allegations themselves because this is a story still pending here, and I'd rather know all the facts before I go into it. Spoiler alert, they're guilty as shit. But anyway, what I am going to do is I'm going to put a link in the description to YongYea. YongYea has put together a lot of evidence and statements from around the internet in a 25-minute clip. He's basically got everything there, so if you want to get up to speed to how things are at the time of this recording, click on the link down below. I'll try and put it on an end card as well to go straight there along with our usuals. But I just want to read out this little thing from Brendan Sinclair over at GamesIndustry.biz called "Past Harassment is Still Present." Now, this is all based around the statement that Activision-Blizzard have gave out in the day following the accusations, basically denying. They're saying the allegations against us are old at this point. This does not represent us as now, and this is Brendan's very spot on rebuttal to this, and I'll explain a bit more afterwards. It's been another bad week for the industry as we see yet another wave of horror stories about the abuse and harassment of women and marginalised people at development studios. This time it's Activision-Blizzard and Ubisoft Singapore. Activision-Blizzard is being sued by the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing after a 2-year investigation by the agency determined the publisher was a breeding ground for harassment and sexual discrimination against women, quote unquote. Ubisoft Singapore was the subject of Kotaku report detailing sexual harassment, bullying, and discrimination against, get this, remember, Singapore, discrimination against Southeast Asian employees, women, and anyone who couldn't speak French. A Singapore studio, I digress. Of course, this is not the first time the publisher has faced allegations of wrongdoing. Last year, it jettisoned a swath of senior management across its studio system after numerous reports of misconduct, including at Ubisoft Singapore. We've sadly seen events like this play out enough now, and we can spot the patterns in response. And there's one in particular that always bothers me. I'll add italics to the quotes to highlight what I'm talking about. Now, he's quoted various parts of the press release, but I'm just going to, for the sake of speeding along here, again, excerpts, full article in the description. One part of Ubisoft Blizzard's statement in response to the lawsuit states, quote, "The picture that the DFEH paints is not the Blizzard workplace of today. Over the past several years, and continuing since the initial investigation started, we've made significant changes to address company culture and reflect more diversity within our leadership teams." Unquote. The thing that all these statements have in common is that they suggest that these reports are based on outdated information. They essentially admit that the things that might have been bad at one point, but they're getting better. They're trying to present past mistakes as irrelevant now because problems have been fixed. If that's true, that's great for the company and the people who work there currently. But this does not magically undo what happened. And many of the actual victims of these companies' negligence, discrimination, and or exploitation are still living with the consequences of that every single day. For many of the people who suffer from employers in environments like these, the wrongs done to them are by no means things of the past. I've written a number of stories with people who speak anonymously about how they were wronged by companies they've worked for. I've talked with a handful of others for stories that were never published for a variety of reasons. Some of the worst stories I've ever heard never make it into print. They may be impossible to tell while preserving anonymity. Or the people telling them they may not want to have their trauma broadcast to the industry at large. My experience here is not unique among journalists who write these kinds of stories. Real short excerpt from Brendan's article. Link in the description below. Please read the full thing, and please check out YongYea's video. If you're watching this after the fact, you may be privy to how this whole thing ended. But if it's still going on at the time of watching, then I would recommend keeping up with YongYea's videos. He's very on the point and prompt with his videos about latest developments in these kind of situations. And I think it's something we, as a gaming community, need to pay attention to. Jim Stephanie Sterling, constantly reports on these kinds of things, be it Ubisoft, be it Activision-Blizzard. No doubt EA will creep up at some point in the future. The gaming industry at its upper echelons just seems to be a cesspit of malpractice. Now, as I said, we're not going to get too much into it, but I just wanted to hammer home a point about living with such things after the fact. Now, I've personally never experienced anything like this, so I'm not talking from personal background here, but I have lived with anxiety and for half my life now, and I know that the kind of thoughts that can rattle around in your brain about something well after the fact. So here's a non-gender specific example of how these people who were wronged years ago are probably not okay right now. Imagine you're employed. Video game, you know what, it doesn't even have to be a video game studio. Just imagine you're employed in a job, and your manager comes up to you and has a discreet word in your ear and says, "So you might be up for promotion soon." Really? Yeah. We'll discuss it about drinks after work. Oh, okay. So imagine you go out for drinks after work. Not just the manager, a couple of people from work. And there's the implied notion that he or she wants to participate in some kind of sexual relations. You feel nervous. You think, wait, will this affect my chance of getting this job? So let's just say you decline. You don't feel comfortable. You're married, or you're just not interested. And then it turns out you don't get that promotion. In fact, you don't even get an interview for this promotion, but it's a real promotion. Oh, is this because I didn't sleep with him? Is this because I didn't sleep with her? What happened? Let's just say you leave that company and you go to work in another company. You're there for a few years, and then you get the same conversation. Hey, there's a promotion coming up. I think you'll be a shoo-in for it. Oh, really? Yeah, we'll go out for drinks after work. What do you say? And immediately, before you even have a chance to rationalise the situation, you start thinking, "Oh, it's this again. Oh my God! Like, what? Maybe I have to sleep with him. Maybe I have to sleep with her." Oh. And that's the way your brain can go in these kind of situations. Again, I'm thankful that I've personally never been in that kind of situation. But things like this can have long-term repercussions. And let's just say that some of these allegations are something that happened several years ago, as Activision put it. Let's just say literally 7 or 8 years ago. These people might have moved on. They might have left the gaming industry and are working elsewhere. They might have moved to a different studio. Some might even still be working there. Imagine they were put in that kind of situation, and imagine when that situation comes up again, the triggers that would come around from that. Now, in the full article, if you want to go and read it in the full, there is one point where he says, "I don't know what the answers are for this." And honestly, I don't have the answers are. I'm just providing some mild commentary, trying to give perspective to those who maybe don't have anxiety or don't quite realise how, several years after the fact, when we usually tell ourselves time heals all wounds, that's not necessarily the case. These are wounds that can stay with people for the longest of times. But I don't have the answers. I don't know how to make this right for people. Now, one thing I know for certain is that being the corporate culture that Activision-Blizzard is, it will probably be a mass form of settlement, which I don't think is good enough. Let me explain. Some people might think that the obvious thing is financial apology. We're really sorry for what happened. Here's $10,000 each. For some people, that will be good enough. It will allow them to buy a few creature comforts that will make their lives a little bit easier going forward. For some people, that won't be enough. So let's just say they turn around instead of say, okay, those of you working part-time, we're now going to grant you full-time employment. For some people, that's great, job security. For some people, they might not want to work there anymore, or have already left. Because there's such personal situations of the victims of these scenarios are all individual, they all won't be the same. They may have been perpetrated by the same person in some cases, but each scenario would be different. And the only thing I do not want to see is for Activision-Blizzard to give a blanket settlement. These were individual circumstances that happened against individuals, and the apology should be personal to each and every person. Each person should be set aside, and Activision should just say something along the lines of, how can we make this better? In some cases, unfortunately, they won't be able to. But whatever they can do to ease that anxiety, that potential scenario I talked through, Activision needs to sit up and pay attention to the individual's needs, not the needs of the claimants, because I believe it's a mass lawsuit. It needs to speak to each individual person. But with that out of the way, we will discuss this when all the facts are clear, etc. Which may not be for a few years. You know how these legal proceedings can take. But our last one today is a bit more optimistic, and something that's really piqued my curiosity. Over the past few weeks, I've been noticing on Twitter this trend about Final Fantasy 14. And I was like, oh right, okay, so that new expansion must be out I've heard about. No, there's no expansion out yet. It's not due out to the end of the year. Well, what's all this about? So I went to Google and I typed in the most pedestrian of questions: why is Final Fantasy 14 so popular? And Victoria Rose over an MMORPG had the answer for me. Again, excerpt article, full article in the description. Victoria writes, there's absolutely no ignoring anymore the massive exodus of gamers into Final Fantasy 14. And put bluntly, it's unprecedented for any game that's run as long as 14 has. Players are noting that servers are getting clogged up, and even Square Enix themselves are having issues getting codes out fast enough. Some call it a World of Warcraft exodus, as many are coming from long-standing king of MMORPGs. Frankly though, it's not that simple. A perfect storm of factors from all over the game and the space has led to these last few weeks. Yes, this includes a backlash against the game's inspiration World of Warcraft, which even the game's director has praised. But players could go to any other MMORPG, including Guild Wars 2, which has a similar free account system to 14 and a perfectly decent story. So what powered the hype for Final Fantasy 14? It's been chugging along for quite a while now actually, and plenty of factors over the past few years have given it fuel. One of the first things you'll hear about 14 is that it only gets better after A Realm Reborn, the base game. In fact, despite being the base game, A Realm Reborn is actually the game's 2.0 edition, so it is already better per se. The tale of Final Fantasy XIV's titular rebirth is an integral part of the game's fame. Director Nakomi Yoshida, who previously helped the Dragon Quest series afloat for Square Enix, was brought on board during Final Fantasy XIV's 1.0 game, which, despite many quirks that are still praised to this day, was considered a complete and utter disaster. The game made a canonical reset by unleashing Bahamut, one of the franchise's most powerful creatures to date, upon the game world in real time, and killing the client and servers at the exact moment. That sounds like a pretty cool in-game event, I must say. Since then, the game's quality has only looked up, especially in regards to its writing, a core necessity in the Final Fantasy franchise. Heaven's Sword, the MMO's first expansion, was considered a phenomenal work of art, a grandiose high fantasy tale that subverts and critiques common tropes of the genre. And while Stormblood isn't considered quite as good, common complaints include it feeling rushed, with it obvious that the two expansions and story were squeezed into one, it's still a perfectly fine expansion to most players. On top of the prior expansion being repeated hits over the years, Final Fantasy XIV introduced and revamped its combat systems and endgame content to make it more approachable to new players. Released in July 2019, Shadowbringers is where most players say the game, and even the Final Fantasy franchise, has peaked so far. It pulls a higher Metacritic score than nearly every other game in the franchise. Arguably, this is where one can say the increase of players trying out 14 began, but game quality alone isn't enough to bring in hundreds and thousands of new players. Already, 14 had a free trial for a while with plenty of the standard anti-bot restrictions. No marketplace, no selling social requests, no private messages, and a currency limit. Notably, it only ran up to level 35, which only gets the player up to a major character revelation before leaving them on an awkward cliffhanger. It also, of course, doesn't allow a fuller kit of combat class abilities, as the first major landmark for class execution is level 50, and continues every 10 levels. When the pandemic hit in 2020, even the limited trial was more than enough for many players to hop on and give Final Fantasy XIV a shot before committing fully to the game and the subscription. There was an obvious bump in players as many quiet worlds began having queues between during peak times. However, around the same time, the Final Fantasy XIV announced the 5.3 patch, Reflections in Crystal, which would expand the trial. Firstly, bookmark this patch in your mind, 5.3. If you're still keeping track of the timeline, that expanded trial was also among a slew of other quality of life updates in the end of the Shadowbringers arc. If you've been in the gaming community within the past few months and seen the free trial meme, this is pretty much where it comes from. Patch 5.3 expanded the free trial to include Heaven's Sword and raised the level cap for all classes, combat and non-combat, to 60. And as previously discussed, Heaven's Sword is goddamn good. Many players prefer it over Shadowbringers by mere personal opinion. But the hype wasn't powered by the trial alone. Reflections in Crystal is still praised as one of the best story content drops to date. It's even considered by some to be better than the rest of the Shadowbringers. It has also implemented flying to the base game's areas, implemented this expansion's obligatory level grinding content, introduced a fan favourite daily tribe quest, and more. In other words, the free trials released during the golden era of Final Fantasy XIV content, right smack in the middle of a global stay-at-home pandemic, sent the hype train flying. And yes, the trial did make a difference, and director Yokomi Nishida told us as much in a recent interview. Again, introducing the free trial to friends became a meme, and bunny girls now wreak havoc across the gaming community. Now for the elephant in the room. The World of Warcraft Exodus. WoW players converting to Final Fantasy XIV has been a phenomenon for quite a while. WoW refugees is a common term for such players, who often contrast their former home with Final Fantasy XIV's relatively accepting user base, approachable combat, transparent development team, and consistent story. These were fairly neutral and even relaxed assessments by such refugees until lately, as vitriol towards World of Warcraft and its development team has been bubbling for a few months now. Players waited for World of Warcraft's first expansion patch 9.1 for 9 months, hoping at least the story would improve. All the while, complaints of a toxic fanbase, time-gated story content, and grinding that felt practically like a forced job of its own continued to bubble up and wear players down. And then, World of Warcraft's 9.1 patch dropped. Unfortunately for Activision-Blizzard, it did not give a fresh breath of air as many WoW players hoped. In fact, the story contained what's been nearly universally panned as awful. A shallow twist for a character that's been, to say the least, troubled. This seemed to be the nail in the coffin for many players, as memes and threads came out calling WoW its own worst enemy. So here we are now with what's essentially one of the, if not the, biggest exoduses into a new non-game and gaming history. The closest player upticks I can think of would be No Man's Sky or Warframe, but neither comes close to what's happening here in Final Fantasy XIV. For now, it sounds like Final Fantasy XIV and its players will have to stick with these good problems among others that come with a wave of new, curious players. Now, I want to play the game now. I've played Final Fantasy XIV once, and that was in the aforementioned base game. In fact, it wasn't even in the base game, it was the open beta or closed beta, I can't remember which, but it was before the game's launch, and I downloaded it, played it on PC. I think I put a solid day into it, maybe about 8 hours or so, and my takeaway was, this is just another MMORPG. I didn't think it was bad, I thought it was perfectly fine. It didn't really feel like a Final Fantasy game to me, but I thought, this is serviceable, I might try the full game at some point. I didn't. I didn't, no. Because once the game came out, the reviews came out, you know, I just lost interest. There's nothing like a slew of bad reviews to really kind of turn you off a game. Not necessarily critic reviews, but if the gaming community at large is panning it as well, it can really turn you off to a game. So then I've just left it. And since then it's just been something that's kind of bubbling in the background. I know of its existence, and you know, I keep track of new releases, so I know they just keep churning out those expansion packs. And I've seen people at my work sometimes playing or talking about it, and I've never really thought about playing it until recently. Now that I've read that article, that's actually made me quite excited to play the game, I must say. Now, I don't have any plans to play it in the short term. Reason being is that there is talks of a Xbox Series X and S upgrade in the future. Apparently they're working on a PS5 upgrade at the moment, and then the Xbox version will come further down the line. So I think I'm probably going to hold out until then. Not just that, but apparently the new expansion that's coming out ends the current storyline that's been coming since the game launched, or since A Realm Reborn launched. So I will be looking to play that at some point. But short term though, I'm really happy for the game that it's managed to come this far, you know, from being on the very crisp of extinction, you know. It's like a dinosaur evolving at the last minute to grow wings to let it flow out to space, you know. So yeah, if you're a Final Fantasy fan, I'd be really interested to know what your story is with the game. If you want to write a letter in, our email address is down below at the bottom of this video. If you're watching this later in life, maybe 6 months after the fact, just double check one of our recent videos just to make sure that this email address is still correct. But I'd be really interested to know what the game's like. So if anyone's watching this who plays Final Fantasy XIV, please write in and just let me know what it is about Final Fantasy XIV that solidifies you as a consistent player in the game. Have you always been at the Final Fantasy XIV? Are you a WoW refugee or a Guild Wars 2 refugee? And if so, what lured you over and what's kept you there? And also, if someone wants to let me know what the story is about in very vague, non-spoilery terms, I mean, feel free to name drop things that are completely out of context for someone who's never played it. But I'd be really interested to hear. So if any Final Fantasy XIV players want to write in, or even if you wanted to talk about it in a topic that's completely your own, feel free to write in. We'll read it out on the air and we'll get a bit of civil discourse going. And with that, folks, that's the end of this week's episode. Just wanted to remind you, similar to what I was just saying just there, this show is going to be a letter writing show as the channel grows. Basically, you can write in about any topic you want within the video gaming space or video game adjacent. If you want to tell me about your favourite game and why it's your favourite game and why you think more people should play it, or why it didn't get a fair chance when it came out 10, 20 years ago. If you want to talk about the recent spurge of video game based Netflix TV series. if you want to talk about the toxicity of certain gamer bases, or the toxicity of the upper echelons of the industry at the executive level, if you want to write in about anything to do with video games, please feel free to do so. The email address is at the bottom, but again, double check a later video if you're watching this after the fact, just to make sure that it is definitely the same email address, because it's only a temporary one for the first few weeks or months. And other than that, folks, that is the end of today's show. So I just want to thank you for watching. If you're watching this at its initial upload, again, early days, I'm not expecting a lot of footfall, but if you're watching this after the fact, thank you for coming back in time and checking this out. Hopefully there's a noticeable upgrade. You may notice from the other 2 videos we've done so far that we now have an actual microphone, and I think I will be upgrading the webcam next, because despite being a HD webcam, it's it's a bit grainy, isn't it? But as long as you can see me, as long as you can hear me, it'll do for now at least. So I'm off to have second breakfast, and thank you all for tuning in, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye.